Brooklyn, a black man slain by a police officer on camera with minimal consequences for the slayer, or preceded by Sean Bale in Queens, New York, a black man slain in a hail of bullets by police officers the night before his wedding, with minimal consequences for the slayer. Or, for example, a few years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, officers caught on camera beating black motorist Rodney King, these officers facing minimal consequences before the city of Los Angeles erupted in flames and chaos. Before I detail how all of this fits into the attack on Du Bois and Robeson, allow me to trace this trend as it relates to others. In other words, even though my talk focuses on Du Bois and Robeson, of course they were not singular. In the era of Jim Crow, many organizations and figures found it necessary to broker international alliances of one sort or another to put pressure on the United States. For example, the organization that became the Nation of Islam in the early 1930s was quite close to Tokyo. Hence the still invoked phrase, Asiatic black man. Elijah Muhammad actually served time in jail during World War II because of pro-Tokyo allegations. This at a time when Japanese bombers had attacked U.S. soil, or what was considered to be U.S. soil, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, successfully, and Southern California unsuccessfully. In fact, when I was in Santa Barbara, living in Santa Barbara, I was living just a stone's throw away from where many Japanese submarines had attacked the shores of Southern California in early 1942. Jack Johnson, the precursor of Muhammad Ali as a controversial heavyweight boxing champion, allied with Mexican revolutionaries some 90-odd years ago at a time when Pancho Villa crossed the border and sacked Columbus, New Mexico. Before the Civil War, as Professor Adosi noted in her introductory remarks, African Americans were enthusiastically pro-British at a time when the Euro-American leadership was the exact opposite, that of course was consistent with a nation that had achieved its independence in the struggle against London in 1776. During this 1776 war that led to the formation of the United States, more Africans fought on the side of the British than with George Washington. And this was by an order of magnitude. Because Great Britain was far more advanced in terms of abolishing slavery than the rebels, most of whom, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, et al., were major slave owners. Indeed, in a book that I'll be publishing in a few months, I make the argument that the 1776 revolt that led to the formation of the United States in many ways was akin to the Unilateral Declaration of Independence in Southern Rhodesia, November 1965, that led to a war that led to the independence of the African nation known as Zimbabwe. The white minority regime in Rhodesia, November 1965, was seeking to escape the logic of decolonization by revolting against London in 1965. I argue in this forthcoming book that with Somerset's case in June 1772 in London, which seemed to prefigure abolitionism in the British Empire, this led directly to a slaveholders' rebellion that culminated in the founding of the United States, and therefore, contrary to what certain historians have suggested, that the glorious so-called revolution that led to the founding of the United States, where the leader somehow forgot to include the Africans, that this was not necessarily a tragic flaw, although it was tragic. It was more like a design flaw. That is to say, this was baked into the cake, and it was inevitable that that particular regime would crash and burn like any other project with a design flaw, which it did in April 1861 with the commencement of the U.S. Civil War, leading to the abolition of slavery. Thus, the founding of the United States in the late 18th century was a real disaster for Africans. It led to a quantum leap in the African slave trade as U.S. nationals moved to replace Britain as the captains of the international slave trade. As I pointed out in my book, The Deepest South, were responsible substantially for so many Africans being in Brazil today as we speak. And as I'm going to point out in a book that will be published in a year or so in Cuba, are also responsible for so many black people being in Cuba. even after the end of the Civil War in 1865, you had U.S. nationals who took the same attitude towards the slave trade as Keith Sweat took towards love. Make it last forever. They moved to Brazil and took some of their Africans with them, many of whom may have been your relatives or your ancestors. And slavery was abolished in Brazil until 1888. As I said in a book entitled The White Pacific, they moved to the South Seas and launched a slave trade, ensnaring Melanesians in particular, people who look like yourself and myself, and dragged them to plantations in Queensland, Australia, and Fiji. Now, these basic realities I am presenting to you were all understood by Du Bois and Robeson. So what happened to Du Bois and Robeson was a result of their seeking to take advantage of an international situation to further black liberation and desegregation, and this was frowned upon by those who ruled the United States, which led to their persecution and, for example, Du Bois' eventual exile. Because of time, I'm going to skip over some of these points and skip to a point that may have some contemporary resonance. And that is that one of the tragedies of that era, the era of Du Bois and Robeson, was that our oldest and largest civil rights organization, the NAACP, did not rush to their defense. Instead, they joined in the attack against these men on the premise that they constituted a threat to U.S. national security, and if they went along with the attack, then black people would benefit. I should also add that Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was the subject of a book I published some years ago called Race Woman, was also part of this leadership corps. She stood with her spouse, W.E.B. Du Bois, all the way until his untimely death in August 1963, and then went on to become a leader in the government of Ghana, West Africa, under the tutelage and leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, before his overthrow in February 1966 with the participation of the U.S. authorities, and then her subsequent exile to Cairo, then Beijing. Now, I'm not here to criticize the NAACP, even though I know that in the state of Michigan there's this controversy about Benton Harbor, and controversies have been erupting about that, but I'm not here to enter that fray. In fact, I'm here to actually praise the NAACP. For just recently, the leader of this organization, Benjamin Todd Gillis, did what Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, did. It did what Du Bois and Robeson sought to do. That is to say that after leading a demonstration at the United Nations in December 2011, a scant year ago, that is to say the NAACP under Gillis's leadership, protesting efforts to throw up barriers to voting, Benjamin Todd Gillis then traveled to Geneva to seek support to block these same conservative measures. He's now, that is to say Mr. Gillis, has now opened the door for the United Nations to examine our plight as a whole, including the proliferation of mass incarceration, the slaying of our youth such as Trayvon Martin, etc. Now, it's difficult to overestimate the significance of this NAACP move. When the NAACP leadership some decades ago chose to attack Du Bois and Robeson, it was based on the premise that the U.S. Supreme Court was a sufficient guarantor of our basic rights. But today, this high court has a conservative majority symbolized by Clarence Thomas, this body's only black member, who paradoxically enough may be the most conservative member of all. Not only that, but as anyone who competes in sports, basketball or tennis, for example, can tell you, it's difficult to improve one's game when the competition is not up to par. And so here in the United States, we're bogged down in these backward discussions as whether there's a need for government. While overseas, the enlightened question is how to make government more effective. And by going to the international community for assistance and counsel, like Robeson and Du Bois and Douglass before him, Benjamin Todd Gillis has to deal with a more sophisticated and intellectually talented group of leaders, and this will inevitably improve the NAACP's game hopefully to our benefit. And by taking our cause to the United Nations, the NAACP acknowledges that the conservative movement in the United States is quite strong and that it is determined to triumph even after the results of the 2012 elections have trickled in. They're determined to triumph by any means necessary, as once again the tumultuous events in Lansing today at the state capitol tend to suggest. However, there is an irony that is yet to be analyzed. Part of the bargain that led to the persecution of Du Bois and Robeson was that in return we would keep our noses out of foreign affairs. Thus, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sailed the war in Vietnam, he too was attacked by certain mainstream civil rights leadership on the premise that he was embarrassing President Johnson, which I thought was his job. And what is perversely ironic about electoral politics today is that because of the bargain on civil rights that led ultimately to the erosion of Jim Crow and the elevation of Barack Obama, is this contradiction that the most passionate and enthusiastic supporters of Mr. Obama, black Americans who voted to the tune of 95% for his re-election, do not have that much to say and are generally unable to lend a hand on some of his most difficult and intractable problems. I speak of foreign affairs. During his visit to the White House some weeks ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was told by President Obama that he had Israel's back. But on foreign affairs, who has Obama's back? Not black Americans, because the tragedy is that black Americans don't even have their own back with regard to foreign affairs. Even some of the most trenchant critics of President Obama in our community, such as Talbot Smiling, do not focus that much on foreign affairs. They focus on domestic affairs, which leaves our community dangerously exposed and guarantees that conservative voices will dominate on foreign affairs, leading inevitably to the ongoing tragedy that is Libya, and perhaps worse to come, Syria and Iran. What black intellectual leader, or black intellectual black leader, for example, besides perhaps Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, can provide a cogent analysis of the war in Afghanistan that is now draining the government budget and draining human lives? Who among them can even give an idea of when this conflict began? If you say during the fall of 2001, under President George W. Bush, who attacked the Central Asian nation on the premise that the 9/11 tragedy was launched there and the Taliban leaders would not turn over the presumed mastermind, Osama bin Laden of Al-Qaeda, if you say that, you'll only be partially correct. Actually, a more accurate answer would be that U.S. intervention in Afghanistan began in 1978 under President Jimmy Carter in response to a rise of a left-leaning political party in Kabul, and this led to this U.S. destabilization effort in league with Osama bin Laden. Check out the movie Rambo 3, for example, starring Sylvester Stallone. It features a bin Laden-type character portrayed heroically, and this depiction did not raise an eyebrow at the time because bin Laden and the United States government were sharing the same trench. According to some press accounts, bin Laden, though his name does not appear in the movie credits, actually has a role in this action-packed blockbuster. When this left-leaning regime in Afghanistan was toppled, unsurprisingly, Taliban-like forces assumed power, and now, of course, the United States is bogged down in a war against these same forces they were sharing a trench with previously. And so this leads to this dilemma that Washington now faces, pulling out of Afghanistan, while some of his advisors and many editorial boards are saying that pulling out runs the risk of the Taliban returning to power with consequences that could lead to another 9/11 and a resultant weakened presidency, according to some.